differentiation, combination, modification, ORQs, ELL strategies, focus with reading, etc. I was like, okay, that's like a month. Yeah. And I said, sure, how long? And it's like 20 minutes. I was like, okay, let's go. So what I have done is combined a little bit of differentiation and the difference between accommodations and modifications, looking at content objectives versus language objectives specifically for ELL as a way to accommodate or modify for students. How doing that for our ELL students is something that would work for a lot of the other students as well, because we're having kids listening, speaking, reading, and writing about the luxurious content that you love and enjoy. Then if we have a time where we'll have a follow-up best practices with ELL and reading and see if you have any questions. And if there's any questions throughout, we can kind of work through it. Okay? It's like on your mark and set, go. The first thing I want you to do is on your skimming and scanning, under first impressions, I want you to think about keywords that are relevant to where you are thinking right now for your focus for your students. It could be related to content, it could be related to the words, differentiated instruction, whatever comes to mind. First impressions, 5 to 6 words that can kind of look, and you're making a list.
About what?
I don't know
Any
what I'm doing.
words that are related to something you're thinking about right now with your students. It could be something
Report
that
cards.
Okay. Then you can continue to think about assessment, communication,
Oh,
feedback,
kind of skim off
makeup,
of that first one?
whatever, yes.
Okay.
So like I read Click, Clack, Move, Cows It Right, Cows It Type, for the purpose of persuasive writing and using that. So some of the words that comes to mind that they are doing is move, barn, farm.
She literally wants to see names, whatever you think of.
About a particular content. Move, barn, farm, Mr. Brown. Hen, duck. Keep it G-rated.
Like, why is she walking around? She's filming this. Application team, small group. And
Hey, don't take my word. I already put that down. I already put that down.
She's taking it.
I know, mine's already down. We're on the same team, so she has to. I already put this down, so.
About 20 more seconds.
I know,
Now, from those list of words, just stop. Is there a subset or a subgroup of those words that kind of have a relationship with one another? So for my example, it could be sounds that are in the book. Because Farmer Brown asked what, the cows are moving, and then the typing is click-kitty-clack. So my actual grouping is related to sounds. And so I'm going to have the label sounds for this particular piece. If I have hen, duck, and cows, that's a subset of my list. And those are animals. And I could get more specific and say farm animals.
Does this go in the fun facts? What? I don't understand. Or we're grouping them within the first impressions? Okay, I got it.
Grouping them within first impressions.
So all yours would be I say really, really your title would be assessment. since we're talking about formula. So really right.
Where do you write your group? Okay, so as you have listed, grouped, and labeled, this is a strategy specifically to show relationships between key vocabulary. What kinds of inferences can students make with a list of words? You can differentiate based on teacher guided. I have index cards in Ziploc bags and have a topic or a concept that we're getting ready to study, and group them in that way where they're actually able to manipulate the words to show relationships, and then that way we can kind of see where the thinking is around comprehension. For instance, it can go across all content areas. It is adapted from Janet Allen's Tools for Content Literacy, and the actual strategy is called List, Group, Label, and for the purpose of thinking about where they're making connections with their vocabulary. So if I could have one or two persons kind of share your list, how you grouped it, and your label.
Okay, I wrote down story problems, addition, subtraction, math games, and so of course I grouped it all in math.
So you used a subset on there because you saw a relationship between all those items for that content.
Mm-hmm.
That's an exact example of what we want kids to do, is make a connection, whatever that connection is, with a group. And would you all agree that all of those would fall under the label math? So give them a thumbs up for that. All right.
Good job, Rita.
All right, next, one more example.
I'll do it. Main idea, supporting details, reading, writing, connection, paragraph structure. I grouped main idea, supporting details, and paragraph structure and labeled that as writing mini lessons.
So what you would do is a support for kids mini lesson or a subset. Good. So then she has a relationship with small parts and there's still some words left over, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so did you group those,
No,
or those
I
are
didn't.
just kind of waiting? Right.
They're just
Okay. So list, group, label is something that you could give words to as far as vocabulary that are key, something that you would do like at even a morning meeting or a calendar time, several time, whatever level pieces, and to think about kids talking about it in a verbal partner practice or having manipulation of cards or having that conversation to show with vocabulary. And so with that strategy comes with things about what is the difference between accommodations and modification, and that was the question that I was given to kind of look like that. Accommodations is something that may change how we actually are teaching the content. So part of the how could be pre-teaching vocabulary if that was kind of given to you. The how could be using some kind of visual support or a graphic organizer to arrange content, for instance. So how is your instructional support for content? Where is a setting sequence? It could be within a whole group, it could be in a small group, it could be a partner practice, it could be independently. It could also be within a resource setting, an inclusive setting, or general. So it's where it occurs, potentially. And when there might be like the addition, subtraction, story problem, some kids, or answering an open response question, they may take part of a day or they may take 2 days. But the actual content standard is the same, just some kids have it over a period of a different length of time. So the key component with accommodation is how it's delivered, where, and when, that actual content. The biggest difference between accommodation and modification is a very significant change in the sense that it may be a different content area standard. Like even if it's with what we're leading up to 4.1 or a Common Core State Standards that will be assessed next year, the modification change is what the student is expected to learn. For instance, if the highest level that I'm looking at on a maybe 2, 3, etc. is inference, able to infer. There are some kids that are still working at paraphrase versus a summarize component. So summarize is retelling using the details that they're reading. Paraphrase is next higher as far as having those details I'm able to then communicate and retell it in my own words versus verbatim what the author says, for instance. So summarize versus paraphrase and putting it in my own words. I read it, I attend to the clues, and then I put it in my own words. And that's a strategy with a mnemonic called wrap. Then inference is I'm able to read it, use those details, and then infer using details that inform or show evidence of why I may be doing that. So the standard is ultimately I want kids at the inference level in reading, but some kids need to have more practice with summary, main ideas, details. How I go about doing that can be an accommodation. Are they highlighting details? Are they cutting it apart? Are they putting it in sequence? Are they being able to make sense of what they're reading? So with this, accommodations and modifications there are 5 statements here. Changes how a student accesses information and demonstrates learning. What I want you to do is think about that statement, and is it an accommodation or a modification?
Accommodation.
Okay, and that is true. So changes how a student accesses information and demonstrates learning. So can you just give me a little bit of why you selected accommodation? You're correct, which is kind of what led
The
you
honest answer is because it says information, accesses information, and that's what it says at the top of accommodation.
in the definition. So you used your context clues.
I did.
Very
You
good.
made it sound smart.
I'm affirming.
There you go.
Changes how a student accesses information is yes, an accommodation. So we're doing that together effectively. So then if I had that kind of partner practice, we did it as a group. And then I'm going to look at does not change the instructional level, the content standards, or performance modifications. Is that an accommodation or a modification?
Accommodation.
And that is correct. And how did you come to that?
Because accommodation is just a different way to teach it so that you get to the same standard.
Okay, so your instructional delivery is the art of teaching that method component. Good. And so both of those justifications are evidence that we are understanding accommodations. Now the third one changes what a student is expected to learn. Accommodation or modification?
Modification. I use the context clues.
Good. So the visual supports are working for you, right? Because we want everybody to be successful, don't we? So changes what a student is expected to learn. So that is where we get into a gray area, is how long do you look at things at a lower level without getting a kid back up to looking at instructional level versus grade level. And so that's where your professional judgment comes into place. Does alter the instructional level, content standards, or performance criteria? That's the fourth one. Would that be accommodation or modification?
Modification.
And your rationale?
It alters the instructional level.
Okay. So,
I mean, a modification is where you're actually changing what the student's supposed to learn
correct.
and not in its delivery.
I like how you worded that. It's a good
Use
example.
context clues.
Criteria during the instruction and assessment phase.
Also, it's a modification too, right?
Right.
Because the criteria is still what they're supposed to learn.
Right. So performance and or working through that. So being able to distinguish between accommodations and modifications, and that's our checking point. So we want to think about when we're trying to reinforce students, we feel pretty good. You should at least have that positive reinforcement and success ratio 4-to-1. In some cases, when we collect data, we'll see kids having 1 positive success to 11 failures. And so how can we reduce that positive piece so that we have a series of positive strokes that would reinforce continued discussion about the content. So with accommodations, And modifications, those accommodations piece are looking at schedule, seating, assistive technology, presentation, kind of like the how component of where it's being delivered. And then the modification, again, is that same activity with a different performance requirement. So if I had different vocabulary related to a concept that we're studying, phases of the moon, and I have axis, full, crescent, what?
Waxing lane.
Yes, waxing lane, whatever. So I could have looking at different relationships and kind of work through it to think about concept. Same activity with a focus on embedded skills. What are the pre-skills necessary so that this kid is successful in an individual task versus working with partner versus a group. And then a different activity with different materials of same content, but only less. And so when you look at that component, I think the idea of working through is assessment accommodations and where that might occur. So with this particular component, Jack is allowed to use a word processor instead of having to handwrite open response questions. Would be accommodation component. Maven learns 10 vocabulary spelling words instead of 20 required for the rest of the class, which would be modification, so it's less. Miss Grant expects first grade social studies to discuss community and impact, etc., but Sully will instead name and explain. So there is a modification of building up to the next level. Okay. Questions about accommodations and modifications? Okay. The next component goes with how do we look at kids practicing their language component. And that is hard to see. Content objective is finding the lowest common multiple, thank you, of 2 or more numbers. And then the language piece is this verb that is to look at writing, listening, speaking, and reading about the content. So if we're going to classify solids and their parts, we want the students who are practicing language, even if somebody who's struggling with communication in any way, shape, or form, it doesn't have to be a person who may be a third language. Like I was working with a student the other day, is proficient as a third grader in 2 languages and learning English as the third language, for instance. So rounding 4-digit numbers to the nearest 10 or nearest 100, that student is going to explain the answer to a partner using a number line. Listing, role playing, and describe. So what is occurring is whatever content objective there is, what are the students doing with that? How much student talking, listening, and reading and writing are they having the opportunity to kind of master that content? Would be the reason for that. There are such a thing as English proficiency standards. Listening, speaking, reading, and writing are the domains of what the kids are actually doing around the content. These proficiency standards are grouped in pre-K to K, 1 to 2, 3 to 5, and it goes across all content areas to support if I'm entering into the English language and if I am bridging or reaching into kind of a typically developing class with language. And so with this elementary piece, K2 cluster here, entering, beginning, developing, expanding. That language would come from the WIDA assessment or access assessment, which is that language proficiency component that might be triggered from a home language survey of 4 questions to see if English is spoken in the home, etc. And with that, looks at if I'm looking in science for grade level cluster 1 and 2, force and motion can kind of be looking at. If I am in the very beginning stages, I want kids going through the same content, so my standard is the same, so it's not a modification, it is an accommodation. So I'm going to have explore movement of real life things. So I have spools, I have cars, balls, oval things versus round things, and what can actually move. Push the ball, watch it move, etc. So they're exploring as they're entering into that. They're moving real life objects at the next level, and saying the car goes backwards, it goes forwards, and finally it stops. So they're listening. This is the listening domain. So they're following directions here. Then they're actually seeing differences between that. And then they're going to, as they are developing their English language proficiency, they're moving objects based on their oral statements. So show me which goes faster, bikes, buses, etc. So they're actually comparing versus predicting, and then able to communicate in a role play fashion. And so one of the easiest things that with working with what teachers say is that I can differentiate for all of my students if I think about what is my content standard, and then I look at when a student works in communication or language, that in itself is a means for me to differentiate. So if I am beginning, I'm going to be naming things or labeling, for instance. I'm describing, I'm stating relationships, and as you can tell, discussing and showing changes in the earth, so you see lots of relationships, and then reporting in details. And this is where we would look at that end of grades 1 and 2 of what our language speaking, typically developing peers would be doing at that particular piece. And so over time, I would be looking at how I move from lots of supports for a student to have them think about their language. In this particular example, the performance indicator talks about what the students will be doing. And in a language objective, and then when I've worked, our principal had us write language objectives and content objectives because they had a high number of ELL. So you have a language function, listening, speaking, reading, writing, whatever term that goes with, what the content is, and then a support strategy is what they're looking. So describe is my language, objects of earth and sky is my content, and then what do I need to be supportive of that content? Observations, photographs, and models. And so looking at how we can think about differentiation would be our next step to think about how we can implement it. Thank you for your time.